the new boss, Joe Biden, victorious in the race for the White House, but with baseless allegations of voter fraud being thrown around by incumbent Donald Trump, it still looks like a rocky road to the inauguration. Ed Blakely is a former Washington insider now living in Sydney, Australia. We're joined this week by Stephanie Zuniga-Maher from Democrats Abroad. I myself am Sean Britton from the radio station 2SER. Just because Donald Trump's leaving us doesn't mean we're going anywhere. We're continuing right on into the Biden presidency. So subscribe wherever you find the podcast. Maybe drop us a review if you're feeling generous. And check us out on Facebook and Twitter at US of Ed. A historic win, a historic speech earlier this week. Joe Biden confirmed to be the next president of the United States, depending on who you ask, with Kamala Harris as VP. Ed, how are we feeling?
Oh, boy, I've got champagne in the corridor. Look, we have to be patient because he's going to use every trick in the book and some we haven't even seen yet to delay the count, etc. What he's trying to do is destroy the democracy. And I don't know how many of his supporters will put up with that, but that's what they're doing now.
Stephanie, anything to add to that?
Look, I would say relief was one of my immediate emotions. When I first heard on, I guess it was Sunday morning, we woke up to the news here in Australia. But, also surprise for me. I was very surprised that 70 million people still voted to continue with the current administration. So I, even though I'm jubilant, I'm a little bit disappointed at the same time. And obviously, those 70 million people are Trump supporters, Republicans. They're probably not all, solely focused on Trump, but certainly I was very surprised that he got as many votes as he did to make it as close as it was.
The first 100 days of the Biden presidency. Stephanie, I'll ask you first, what are the priorities?
His biggest priority has to be getting more of a handle on COVID and the coronavirus. And really coming up with a science-based, fact-based plan to combat the ravages of the illness and how it's really affecting the American, the health system, the public, and also the economy. And so between COVID and the economy, I think those really need to be his two biggest challenges. But I think we're also seeing that the longer the, post-election period draws out and the less willing that Trump is to actually accept the results of the election, the more difficult a job Joe Biden will have in his first 100 days. To this point, the Trump administration hasn't been helpful at all with facilitating the peaceful transition of power. So it could be that his first 100 days in office, he figures out what documents were shredded, lost, buried in the last week or so, and really tries to put the government back together in a meaningful way.
I would add one other thing, and that is reaching out to our foreign allies and close friends who are jubilant with this, and we need them, like we put pressure on illegitimate governments. We need them to say, this is a legitimate government. This is a government we're going to pay attention to. And the markets will react to that. And once they react, I think Biden will be clear and home. And he's got a great, strong fighter right next to him, Kamala. She'll fight those battles on the elections and all that kind of stuff.
Of course, a big part of this is going to depend on who controls the Senate. Georgia was a big part of this election. It's a shame Dana Rawls couldn't join us today as she hails from the great state of Georgia. Georgia was one of the biggest stories of this election, thanks in large part, to the efforts of Stacey Abrams. Now, Abrams
and Dana Rawls.
She's certainly got a vote in. Look, Abrams reckons she took about 5 minutes to celebrate and then started pouring efforts back into that Senate race. Ed, what's going on here?
Well, there are two Senate races in Georgia. One senator resigned, which requires an election to fill that seat, and then the ordinary seat was up for election. And I won't go into all the complexities, but in Georgia, you have to have 50% or more of the ballot to be elected in the first election. And if you don't, there's a runoff. So there's a runoff in the regular, Perdue versus Ossoff. And in the other election, there's a runoff because there was the previous election, the one we witnessed, was a runoff between two candidates, Wonkock and Loeffler. So those four people will be on the ballot. The question here, can Stacey get the game up twice? That's going to be really tough, really tough. But there's one factor. Rural voters usually don't vote in very high numbers in runoff elections. And the big deal, they're there. But when the runoff occurs, they want to go back to the farm or do whatever they want to do. Now, this is true for rural African American voters as well. So whoever gets those rural voters up, the city voters, you don't have to worry about too much. They're there. But the rural voters you really have to worry about. And the voters who helped here, again, were the educated voters in the college towns. Every place there was a university, Biden won big.
Unfortunately, we do have to touch on Donald Trump with the incumbent president. Look, as much as I'd love to stop mentioning his name, he's now refusing, of course, to concede the election. He's making these constant allegations of fraud and malfeasance completely without any kind of evidence. And it would be completely farcical. I mean, it is completely farcical, but it's also doing immense damage to the United States and the U.S. electoral system.
Yes, it is. And that's what I said a little bit earlier, and that's why we need our foreign allies to step up and say, this is over as far as we're concerned. Pompeo is going to Europe to talk to the allies. If I were anyone, I would not let my foreign minister talk to him. I'd say, we're going to abide by the results of the American election. We don't know, President Trump is still in, so there's no reason for us to talk to you. But we have strong anticipations of a President Biden, and we will not undercut him. Be a simple message. His real reason for being there is to find more dirt on Biden. This is a second or third go-through on this.
And Stephanie, you mentioned, of course, this is damaging to the Biden transition.
Definitely. I mean, first of all, we've said this a lot about 2020, but it's completely unprecedented for an outgoing president to not assist with the incoming president, just in terms of, getting security briefings, making sure that there's no lapse in things like national defense, which, Trump did. I think he fired the Secretary of Defense or resigned.
No, he fired him.
Yeah. So, it's in terms of being able to take over day one with a country that is secure, that is, and be fully briefed on what the challenges may be. Well, who's in charge in the Trump White House in the moment? Who's running the show? I mean, you have a 74-year-old man baby throwing a massive tantrum, and who is actually keeping the country running while President Trump is sulking and not cooperating with the rest of the world?
And Mark Meadows, his chief of staff, has COVID.
That's right.
But the White House is the last place I'd go. If I were Joe, I'd stay out of there for a year.
It needs to be disinfected through many illnesses, I think.
Yeah, I think it'll have to be totally disinfected.
Yes. Ed, I'm not saying this is a particularly competent coup, but if it walks like a coup, it looks like a coup, it quacks like a coup, at what point does this become an attempted coup?
Insurrection Act requires that armed people have to approach the government and try to secure it. And I think he's looking at that option. The U.S. Army has basically said, thus far, they won't play. But who knows? He may have some little hooligans that he deputizes and makes them militia or something and attacks the U.S. government. If so, he's committed treason.
I think what happens on January 20th and January 21st. I think it's really, I'm watching with bated breath to see what actually happens on Inauguration Day, to see how far he does push it.
Oh, I suspect he won't be there on Inauguration Day. Herbert Hoover barely showed up and stayed in a separate car and stayed his distance and stood across the aisle while Roosevelt was being sworn in. I think if that's the best he will ever do, but my suspicion is he will not be there. There's no requirement for him to be there.
Which would, again, be so bizarre in terms of the peaceful transfer of power.
That's right.
And so unfortunate in terms of America's standing in the world and respect on the world stage.
Absolutely.
We're hearing Republicans are quietly embarrassed by Trump's behaviour. Some are quietly congratulating Joe Biden by handing messages through their Democratic colleagues. But very, very, very few are willing to say anything out loud, publicly. What hold does Trump still have on these people?
Well, he has two holds. One of them is they're afraid that he will run a candidate against them in the next election. The other is he got the second highest total votes ever. That means money. And if you're going to go out and raise money, you have to be really careful that you have a machinery like a party behind you. But this is your territory, Stephanie, not mine.
Well, no, I would say, it's interesting that you bring up the money because, of course, they're all supporting this Trump Victory Fund and all the emails that are going out to ask for money to help fund, Trump's rightful election win. When really, when you look at the fine print, apparently most of it's going to the GOP, which means that a lot of the senators and a lot of the people in the party can tap into that to fund their own election debts. So they're maybe not lining up to support Biden because they still have their hand in Trump's pockets and are still using his name for monetary benefit and gain.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see kind of how that plays out over the next few weeks as well.
If Trump is looking to cause more damage on his way out, what more do we need to be wary of?
A couple of things. One of them is that he will, as you suggested, destroy various pieces of information needed by the next president, particularly international information dealing with China and the rest. The second is the business of pardons and trying to pardon himself, trying to pardon all of his people, including Barr, etc., and trying to create kind of a web of impossibility of the court coming after him. He thought appointing these justices meant they had fealty to him. It's pretty obvious they don't.
And can I just bring up one more thing that I think we really have to be concerned about? When Trump leaves office, he will owe someone $400 million. Even more than destroying secrets, I would be concerned about him selling secrets to foreign.
Yes, that's right.
So that, I think, is what we really have to be concerned about, because at the moment he still has access to every bit of classified information that the government has. And that information is worth a lot of money, and he needs money.
And he's sent his minions in. He's fired Esper and everybody at the top and the intelligence agencies. Maybe that's the reason, so he can walk out with a trove of secrets. But, of course, that is a violation of the Espionage Act. I'd love to see him housed in Moscow, like Edward, what's his name?
Snowden.
Snowden. Trump and Snowden might get rooms next to one another.
And Ed, you mentioned the justices there. I did want to touch on the Supreme Court. Judges Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts have indicated the Affordable Care Act could be upheld even if the court finds part of it unconstitutional. A blow for Republicans who have tried to tear this down any way they can. Roberts had to say, I think, frankly, that they wanted the court to do that, but that's not our job. Is this a lifeline for Obamacare, Ed?
I think it is. I think it definitely is. And what this will mean, Joe will just have to amend the existing act and move forward.
And just finally, what you did touch on this before, but what do you make of the international reaction both to Biden's win and Trump's refusal to concede?
I think people were dismayed.
And Stephanie, anything to add before we let you go?
Well, I was going to say, I think it's very telling that our allies were so jubilant and so excited to see Biden win. And many of them privately have been quite negative on Trump, but finally they could more outwardly, vocally express their jubilation that he was no longer going to be the head of the government.
Ed and I will be back next week to talk the latest in US news and politics. Subscribe wherever you find the podcast and check us out on Facebook and Twitter at US of Ed. US of Ed is produced in the studios of 2SER in Sydney. Help support the work we do by going to 2SER.com.